Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. A chilly November evening. We're glad to bring this speaker series, as we used to call it, back this year. We had a couple of great events in the summer, and we're super excited to have Laura Kiesel here. But I'm Erica. I'm the executive director here at Wright Locke Farm, and I always ask for a show of hands. Is there anybody who's here for their first time here at the farm? Couple folks. Nice. Welcome. A lot of familiar faces, and we appreciate that. But if you're interested, we have a lot of things going on here at the farm, especially this time of year. So if you're interested in our newsletter, please sign up. It's back by the door. We have a pretty extensive newsletter that talks about all of the things that we have going on in education, public and private events, agriculture, but also other community events. And then workshops like this and some fun holiday things coming up, like family cookie making and goat walks and wreath making and spoon carving, all the fun things. So check us out and keep in touch. And now I'm just so happy to welcome Laura here for this super important event that affects us as well, because we are a farm with animals, so we do have a lot of rats. And we don't use poison. We're a certified organic farm, but it's really hard to manage them. And we have a ton of hawks too. So they do some of the work of managing the rats, but as we'll hear, that does no good if we're just killing off the hawks through the poison that's being ingested. And we do find dead rats around the farm that must have acquired poison somewhere else. And that, of course, makes us nervous for our own pets who might get into that and things like that. So very important topic. And so I'm going to turn it over to Laura from Save Arlington Wildlife. Thanks.
Thank you. Can the lights get dim just a little bit? Thank you so much. So I want to thank, this is actually Save Winchester Wildlife, which is one of our kind of spin-off initiatives of Save Arlington Wildlife. Helped arrange for this, so I first want to thank them, and I of course want to thank Wright Locke Farm for hosting the event. I love this place. I've been coming here for about 5 years, so when they asked me for a biopic, this is actually one of the few pictures where you can see my face clearly from the past couple of years, and as you can see, this is me with two of the resident goats here at Wright Locke Farm. That little guy is Rufus. He's my favorite. And that bigger guy, well, they get very jealous, the big goats, so they always want to get petting. So I just wanted to have that picture just to show that I'm always here. I come here almost every week. It's not letting me. Eric, it's not letting me go to the next slide. Oops, there it goes. It was stuck. So as was just said, Wright Locke Farm is home to many birds of prey, especially hawks, and these are my photos that I just saw in the past 6-7 months. There's a red tail in the middle. Red-tailed hawks are our most common birds of prey, and that Cooper's hawk in the left, that was actually a hawk I saw the day I came here for the interview to be a part of this speaker series just a couple of months ago at the end of August, just to further illustrate the point that was made. I was walking after our talk, and this Cooper's hawk swooped down and caught a mouse on the field and went up in the tree with it. And at the far right, that's a red-shouldered hawk, and that's the first and only red-shouldered hawk I've ever seen in Massachusetts. They're a little more rare. So I want to get started with this quote by Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring. "The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can only do so when in full possession of the facts." And that's my goal tonight, is to try to give you a comprehensive review of the facts. And I think you'll find that a lot of what we're going to be reviewing tonight will be resonant of what Carson saw with pesticides, like DDT, during when she was writing Silent Spring. So how I came about getting interested in this issue is, well, my academic background my first degree is in journalism, but then I went back to school for wildlife biology, and I finished my master's degree in environmental science and policy. And one day, when I was living in an affordable housing complex in Arlington, I came out of the building in 2015, and there was a pest control professional, and he was putting about 20 bait stations around my complex, and I knew what they were. I knew what was in them. I knew how they impacted the wildlife, and I started asking him questions, and immediately the energy changed between us. And he started saying a lot of things that weren't true. He said that they were traps, and I was like, well, it's labeled as poison bait. I was like, they're not trapped in there. And I said, so anything that eats those rats or mice could get poisoned as well. And he said, no, that's not true. Then I went above him and I spoke to the landlords, and at first they wanted to take the poison away, but then they said, well, we spoke to the pest person. They said, you have no idea what you're talking about. Again, I had a background in wildlife biology, so we're going to keep them. But what was very concerning is that kind of kicked off a trend in Arlington, and as you know, this whole metro area and beyond. Because up until that point, I hadn't really seen these bait stations very often, but over the next 6 months to a year, they mushroomed all over to the point where I couldn't walk a block without seeing them. And so in 2018, I wrote an article for Dig Boston. As I said, my first degree is in journalism, so when I was hitting wall after wall, I decided to turn to my training as a journalist and follow this issue as a reporter. And then in 2021, after the first bald eagle in Arlington died, which I will elaborate a bit more on in a minute, I did a second article for Dig Boston. This one was syndicated in Salon, a national publication, and it also was a finalist, a top 5 finalist for the David Carr Award for Investigative Reporting. So tonight, there's many different types of rat poisons, and there's the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, there's the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, otherwise known as SGARs and FGARs. And then there's other rodenticides which are not anticoagulants, like bromethalin, which is a neurotoxin, and calciferol, which is basically vitamin D. As the wording suggests, anticoagulant means the poisons work by inhibiting the ability of the animal that ingests it to make vitamin K, and vitamin K helps the blood to clot, is sort of a simplistic way of explaining it. So it stops the blood from clotting, so the animals usually hemorrhage to death. And these other ones, like I said, the bromethalin is a neurotoxin. Tonight we're mostly going to be talking about the anticoagulants, though I will briefly also talk about bromethalin and the vitamin D as well in passing. But it will mostly be the anticoagulants, and especially the SGARs, because those are the poisons causing the lion's share of the problem. Now, perhaps you have come to this issue, as many people in the area have, through how it's been impacting our bald eagles. So bald eagles were nearly wiped out of the state and the country in the 60s due to the pesticide DDT and some of its close relatives. And this is another way that it's very reminiscent of Carson's, what Carson chronicles in Silent Spring. So the bald eagle was extirpated in the lower 48 states. DDT was banned in 1972. The bald eagle remained endangered until 2007, so not that long ago. That's on the federal endangered species list. However, they remained on the state endangered species lists, because many states have an endangered species list separate of the feds, until 2012, so only a little over a decade ago. And they're also on a lot of other state endangered species lists in the Northeast, including New Hampshire, Connecticut, I believe Maine as well. And so they're still in a pretty precarious state right now. So right now they're listed as a species of special concern. They were demoted from threatened status in 2020, 2021, and almost immediately after, several bald eagles in Massachusetts died of SGAR's poisoning. Not that it's directly correlated, but it just shows that perhaps maybe it was premature to take them off the threatened status. There are only about 80 breeding pairs in the state. Now, this was the first bald eagle that died in 2021. This was in Waltham along the Charles River, this is a photo these photos are from my friend Margaret Lewis. On the left-hand corner, you can see how gorgeous she was. This was taken, I think, only a few weeks before she died. And in the second photo, you can see her being removed from the nest. She was actually incubating some eggs. So her eggs were unhatched. She was removed from them. And so not only did she die, but the eggs she was incubating obviously did not hatch. So there were no chicks that year. And even though the state said that that was the first formal death of bald eagles in the state, that's the only first death that they recorded that they did a necropsy for that they were tracking. Because this was another bald eagle only a few years before, in 2018, that the Cape Wildlife Center was treating. And they didn't get a necropsy, but it had all the signs of rodenticide poisoning. Now, after the Waltham bald eagle died, around this time I was spending, usually once or twice a week, I'd go to my local cemetery where MK the bald eagle had offspring. These were her first viable offspring, and that was C25. This was my first glimpse of her. I think she's a few weeks old, 4, 5, 6 weeks old. She looks like she's from the dark crystal, and I basically spent a lot of that summer tracking her and her sibling C26. The last time I saw them alive, which is when I visited, was on the 4th of July. I figured it was a pretty appropriate day to visit the bald eagles. And here's C25 in her nest. Now, I watched MK the eagle bring her and C26 a giant dead rat from one of the nearby buildings, and I watched them tear it apart. It's hard to tell, it's because sometimes pictures, there's these sort of optical illusions, but I noticed that there are what appear to be these green flecks of paint-looking type of stuff on her wingtips. You can maybe see it on the bottom. So these poisons, these anticoagulant baits, are dyed a very phosphorescent blue or green because they're poison, and they actually can dye the intestinal tracts of the rodents, and you can find pictures online of like birds of prey disemboweling rodents, and you can see the bright green or red in there, like that's coming out. So I was worried that that was splatter, because you can even see some of it on the green because they had just devoured a rat when I took that photo. And I got very busy and I couldn't see them for a few weeks, and then I heard that C25 was rushed to Tufts Wildlife Clinic at the end of July. I think it was July 21st. And not even 2 hours after she was admitted, she died. Earlier that day, she was seen by the wildlife photographers who watch her like she was on a low branch, which is unusual. She was sort of nodding off. She had a talon dangling. So this was not typical behavior for an eagle in the middle of the day. And then she basically landed face down on the grass and wasn't moving. So they did perform a necropsy for her, as they did for the Waltham eagle, and confirmed that it was Escar's poisoning that killed C25, as it did the Waltham eagle. So that was 2 eagles confirmed dead due to these rodenticides in only about 5 months' time, which was very alarming in the community. So to fast forward a little bit, so C25, like I said, died in 2021. And that was when I also did my article, was in the months after that article in Salon. And then this is MK. This was actually my first sighting of her in April 2021, around the time that she had set up the nest in the cemetery. And I don't know if C25 or C26 were hatched yet. But they were either laid as eggs, or I think they had just hatched. So in 2022, they did have 2 offspring, and unlike C25 and C26, they managed to pull through. Neither of them got sick or died, and everyone was pretty relieved. And I think people got a little like, okay, we're doing better now. But then as folks might have heard, in March of just this year, actually it was the end of May, MK was spotted on the ground. She was shuffling around at dusk. Again, these are daytime predators. If you see them around at dusk or twilight, especially if they're walking around on the ground where they're susceptible to predators, call a wildlife rehabber or call Tufts Wildlife Clinic or environmental police. So some people had noticed this, and they tipped off some people who work in wildlife rescue. So they got MK and they brought her to the New England Wildlife Center in South Weymouth. And the first night she actually pulled through, and it seemed that she might be able to survive what they were thinking was a case of Escar's poisoning, because her blood was not clotting when they did a blood draw. But unfortunately, the second night, she succumbed to a massive internal hemorrhage. I think she sneezed or coughed, and that was it. It just ruptured. And an artery or something. And that's how these poisons work. They weaken your veins and arteries to the point where they can like explode like volcanoes, even if you're doing something small like sneezing or coughing. And this is not unusual. So I just want to say, like, this is not an anomaly that these poisons are having an impact on bald eagles. There was this study that came out in 2021, which was around the same time I was watching MK and excited for her first offspring in Arlington, that found that over 80%, I think it was 82% of bald and golden eagles that were surveyed, and these were from samples all across the United States, tested positive, and these were necropsies of carcasses, for very high levels of Escar's poisoning in their systems. And I just want to backtrack, and I say that one of the things that I think is so devastating about MK is MK and her mate KZ were the first bald eagles to nest in Arlington in like 60 or 70 years since DDT wiped them out. So the fact that here we are, they're barely getting a toehold in this area, and they're already being compromised or even eradicated in some areas from a different class of poisons. It's a very tragic thing to witness, and you feel very helpless about it. And the ones in the bald eagle in Waltham, who died, I heard that she was, I think, the offspring of the first bald eagle to hatch in Charles River area about a decade ago, since DDT wiped them out. So they're already getting their populations reduced by these poisons. So when MK died, I was very upset. This was like on a string of a bunch of losses. So I had announced on Facebook that I was going to have a vigil and a march from the town green in Arlington to the town hall. And I knew there was going to be a good turnout, but I was bowled over. Over 300 people showed up, media from all around the state. So I think this again just shows like what the bald eagle means to people. And I can't even express how powerful it was to see people marching, like the traffic. These cars were stopped for 10 minutes just to get people to cross the street. But it's not just, oh, this is stuck again. I think it's because it's not just bald eagles that are impacted. Now, bald eagles and peregrine falcons are the ones that are still on the state endangered species list, so they're the ones that the state is going to track if they find a dead body or if they find an animal that's sick. But all these other species that are impacted that are not listed, for the most part, the state's not tracking them. And great horned owls are a very susceptible species, and what happened for us in Arlington is after C25 died in 2021, in 2022, the end of 2021, we got this pair of great horned owls that started nesting in Menotomy Rocks Park. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that park. It's in the Heights. And they were the first great horned owls I know of that were nesting there in a while. Since I lived in Arlington, I've lived there over a decade. I watched them build their nest up. They had these babies. I watched them every day, not every day, but several times a week, as did many other people, kind of keeping track of them. This was taken only a week or so before they were found, all three of them, dead. Now, they were already in fledgling stage, similar to C25. They were getting ready to leave the nest. And then we didn't see them for a couple of days, and people were worried. And then the mother and one of the fledglings was found on the ground just a few feet apart. Now, a necropsy was not performed, again, because the state does not perform necropsies on great horned owls. Our animal control officer at the time said that they were exhibiting signs of anticoagulant poisoning. Namely, they were still spilling watery blood post-mortem, which is very unusual. Usually blood will clot and turn a tarry black. She did I think she actually did a dissection, and they were still spilling. Their cavity was filled with like blood that was like Kool-Aid. So these are very telltale signs of anticoagulant poisoning. It made the Boston Globe, which is unusual for a non-MESA listed species that it got so much media attention. But I think it was because the community was just so outraged that a lot of reporters were hearing about this. And only a few days after those two were found, unfortunately, the third fledgling was also found dead. And I don't think that was as conclusive whether he died because of anticoagulant poisoning or because he didn't have the mother to take care of him. But so basically almost the entire nest was wiped out. And this is pretty typical with Escar's poisoning. So my partner and I were worried about the widower male owl. Many birds of prey, like eagles and great horned owls, mate for life. Like their instinct is to be paired. So we would sometimes, like in the summer, go at twilight and listen to him hooting, and it was very heartbreaking that there was like no rejoinder. But we were very excited when at the end of November, we saw that he had attracted another mate. And then about 2.5 weeks later, she was found on the ground coughing up watery blood. Our former ACO, Diane Welch, called, I think it was Cape Ann Wildlife, and they came and got her. And she died en route to the wildlife clinic. So when the first 3 owls died, we were told by the town, well, we don't know if it was poisoning, we're not sure, we can't tell without a test. So this time we actually worked to get her body to a necropsy, and it was very conclusive that it was extremely high levels of Escars that undoubtedly contributed to her death. And around the same time, and this didn't make any news media because I just was sort of privy to it behind the scenes, there was also a Cooper's hawk nest in my neighborhood. It was right on Minuteman Bike Path near Spy Pond. This is one of the fledglings from when it was still in the nest, just fledgling a little after it left the nest. And then here's one of them. I don't know which one because there were 5 of them that was found dead in someone's backyard in the neighborhood. And this was the same around the same time that owl was found, shortly before. And we also had his body sent to in for a necropsy as well. And what's interesting about this necropsy, well, one, sometimes I've had places tell me, well, Cooper's hawks won't get poisoning because they primarily eat songbirds, not rodents. But there's actually quite a bit of studies that Cooper's hawks are dying in some pretty remarkable rates of rodenticide poisoning. That could be because they're eating more rodents than we're giving them credit for. But also there's some interesting studies that are showing that songbirds, like sparrows, are getting into these bait boxes and eating it. So it's getting into the food chain that way, as well as insects also eat the bait and songbirds eat the insects. So there might be other ways that Cooper's hawks and some of these other predators that you don't think of as easily susceptible might be getting it in. But what's also interesting to me about this is that the poisoning that by far is the highest, the Escar, is bromadiolone. And that has emerged by something that pest control professionals are telling people is the innocuous Escar, like the low toxic Escar. I'm even having a back and forth right now with the New York City Department of Conservation because they use bromadiolone in their city parks, including Central Park, because they've been told by the pest companies that it is a low toxic Escars that will have minimal to no impact on the birds of prey. And that is not scientifically accurate. But this has been going on for a long time. So I don't know if people remember this one. This happened all the way back in 2014, I believe. So about a year before I started getting involved in this fight. Is Ruby the red-tailed hawk was probably the first high-profile death in the area at Fresh Pond. Like she had a live cam, so she had fans from around the country who watched her. She was found dead, and they did the necropsy at Tufts Wildlife. And I think that was one of the first time there was some raising of public awareness, and there was a little bit of an effort to get rid of the bait boxes. But I go to Fresh Pond a lot to shop, and including that building where that hawk nest is covered with bait boxes containing Escars. And it's, as you know, very close to Fresh Pond Conservation Area where there are great horned owls, barred owls, and also where MK spent a lot of time as well. Yes?
You're getting to this, I'm sure you're
Yeah.
The boxes, I know now there are some that do other ways of dispatching the rats.
Yeah.
And they might look like a regular bait box where they electrocute.
Yeah, I'll speak about that. Yeah. Don't worry. There's a whole arc to this. So Tufts Wildlife Clinic is actually the foremost authority on the topic of the impacts of rodenticides and especially anticoagulant rodenticides on birds of prey. They did a study about 12 years ago, I think it was, where they did necropsies on a whole range of birds of prey that they had found or had access to at the clinic, and they found 86% were testing positive for escar's exposure, which was a pretty remarkable number. But only about 6 years later, I think she started, Dr. Maureen Murray is her name, the lead researcher, she started doing these censuses again over another like 8-year period or so. And in just like a decade, it jumped from 86% to 96% of the birds that she was necropsying were testing positive for escar's exposure. And 100% of red-tailed hawks, which as we all know is our most common bird of prey. But it also isn't just birds of prey or raptors. Like rodenticides impact a whole diversity of species. Basically, first and foremost, anything that will eat rodents or predate smaller creatures are susceptible. Coyotes, foxes, skunks, raccoons, possums. I think a lot of people might not even realize that, these mesopredators like skunks, raccoons, possums actually eat a fair amount of rodents themselves. They're part of the food chain that help keep the rodents under control. Bobcats. Now, some of the deaths that are caused by escars and other anticoagulant rodenticides aren't just direct, not just like from the blood thinning or the hemorrhaging, but sometimes it's like an indirect way it's causing death. For instance, coyotes and foxes are very susceptible to sarcoptic mange, who have escars in their system, and they've done enough studies to show there's a direct correlation between having high amounts of escars in their blood and then developing sarcoptic mange. And the mange is what ultimately will kill them and be considered by the state or the feds, and it's not going to be put down as escar's poisoning, but it is what is contributing to their death. That fox was treated at Newhouse Wildlife Rehabilitation. Some people might be familiar with her. She's in Chelmsford. That poor fox did not make it. It had a very severe case of sarcoptic mange. That skunk also was treated at Newhouse and also did not make it. That possum was found dead in Arlington and was showing signs of anticoagulant poisoning. Over in California, one of the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides known as difascinone has been found to cause a different kind of mange in bobcats and was wiping out entire bobcat populations in California. And actually, they just added difascinone to the list of the rodenticides they are now banning in California. They've already banned most of the escars in most sectors, but now difascinone is also banned because it's such a risk for the bobcats. And it was even felling mountain lions in California, and people are really shocked sometimes. I work closely with the person who started Raptors Are the Solution in California, and she's the one who was basically instrumental to getting a ban passed there. And she said it was really the thing that impressed people the most was that these poisons were felling these giant creatures, and people don't realize that mountain lions too eat rats. But it's also pets. So every year, the MSPCA reports that they get dozens of cases that they're treating of suspected or known rodenticide poisoning in cats and dogs. Of these, they tend to peak in spring or fall, and that's also when rodent populations tend to boom, and so where people might be putting out more poison. The average cost of care is $2,000, and it takes weeks of supportive care and medication. That's my cat, Samson. And he actually did once catch a mouse a year or so ago. And luckily, he just put it in his box with his toy mice alive and didn't try to eat it. But I was very concerned because there were so many bait stations at my residence at the time. But I want to backtrack a little and let people know that this really started not even with animals, but with children. So these poisons used to be available, the escars I'm speaking about, over the counter. So you could buy them at any hardware store up till about 2015. In 2008, the EPA finally started to say, to the manufacturers, Bell Labs and stuff, and Decon, you have to take them off the shelves because they were poisoning thousands of children every year. Now, these were disproportionately low-income children, usually black and brown children. So there was an environmental justice aspect to this issue too. And the EPA didn't even do this until they were getting sued by public health and environmental advocates for not acting to protect the children. So the EPA finally acted in 2008, and then the manufacturers balked, especially the ones who do decon, and they were like, no, we're not going to take it off the shelves because it's an acceptable risk, the 10,000 children or so a year that are getting poisoned. So they were tied up for years in this legal battle with the manufacturers of the rat poison until they finally agreed to a negotiation in 2014 that they would pull the eschars-based decon and come up with different formulas. But what they would do is they would allow licensed pest control professionals to have these in the tamper-resistant bait stations. Now, that has helped a little with children getting poisoned less by eschars specifically. It has not eliminated poisons of eschars for children. I'd still argue that I don't think any rate is acceptable. But what is interesting is that the FGARs, which are still available over-the-counter child poisonings, while they have decreased for eschars, they've almost completely, it's like there's now a corresponding increase in FGARs poisoning of children. So it seems the poisoning has just shifted to a different kind of poison that is harming children that are still available on the shelves.
Did the children die?
There have been a couple of deaths but they say, is it really that or is it something else? But they have, it's usually about 10,000 a year. These are usually come from emergency room hospital records and poison control center call-ins for the rates. So it might also be lower, it might be higher than what is being reported if they don't know to call poison control if they weren't making it to an emergency room. So some may be sick and not know depending how much the child ingested. So there's a few problems with the tamper-resistant bait stations. One of them is that people can still buy huge vats of some of these poisons online. This was a really good article in a National Audubon magazine in 2021, I believe. Yes, 2021, about that. You can still go on Amazon and get a giant tub of brotaphacum if you want to. And that is a problem that the EPA hasn't really done much to close that loophole. The other problem is that these bait stations, when I first started getting involved with this, a lot of the pest control professionals were telling me they were tamper-proof. They're not tamper-proof, they're tamper-resistant. There's a big difference. I have regularly seen bait stations tampered with or broken open or degraded. Here's a bait station in Arlington that's right outside of a Petco and there was a puppy training class going on feet away where you can see there's a hole open and the bait is exposed. Here's another incident that happened in Arlington where the squirrels broke open the bait station and were dispersing the bait among themselves. And then a couple of days later, they started dropping dead out of the trees. But the third problem is, and this is the problem that I think, that I've been addressing the most tonight in this PowerPoint, is the secondary poisoning. These bait stations do nothing to stop the predators from eating the rodents that exit the bait stations, and now themselves, the rodents are now the toxic, poisonous thing, and they're just mobile. So I watched this red-tailed hawk last year for an hour stalk a rat that went into a bait station, and then the red-tail landed and watched him exit, and luckily someone exited the building right around this time, and the red-tailed hawk flew away. But I've regularly observed birds of prey watching around dumpsters in areas where there's a lot of bait stations. And the EPA knows all about this. So every couple of years, the EPA does what's called an ecological risk assessment. There are like a dozen of these reports. I read them all for my article in 2021. And they all make the same conclusion, which is that these poisons are very toxic to non-target animals. But yet they still then allow it to be legal. This was the conclusion of their 2020 report, which says the risk to mammals and birds is well established and includes mortality from primary and secondary exposure, as well as chronic growth and reproduction effects. The reason why the EPA is still allowing this, when people have asked me, is I say, well, they're basically right now a compromised agency in many ways. They're disinvested. They're not funded adequately. That's part of it. But the truth is they have a very intimate relationship with the industries that they are regulating, and there's a revolving door with those industries. A lot of them go to work for these industries afterwards, so they do not want to get on their bad side. So they're very reluctant to constrain them on using chemicals. And this is something that's been reported on a lot in recent years. This is one really good piece in ProPublica This was a series, the whole series that was done in The Intercept in 2021. There was a bunch of whistleblowers at the EPA that were saying that we're letting a lot of chemicals that are very dangerous out into the environment, where we're told to rubber stamp them. And then they got fired, I think, for whistleblowing, and they filed a suit. So that's ongoing right now with the EPA. And just to show, so since the 1970s, they've recorded about 1,200 confirmed deaths from anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning. Now, that's just with a few states reporting, and as I already said, a lot of times those states are only getting like a very small percentage of animals that they're looking at, and usually those are ones that are MESA listed. But just to show you how bad the discrepancy is, up there it says barred owl, like only 3 barred owls have died of Escar's poisoning since the 1970s. I mean, and New England Wildlife Center here says they've seen 40 barred owls in the past 2 years or something since with Escar's poisoning, and double-digit numbers of them have died. So obviously there's a huge discrepancy on what the wildlife rehabilitators are seeing on the ground and what EPA is reporting. So New England Wildlife Centers, which is in South Weymouth, they're just one wildlife rehab center in one part of one state. They see between 100 and 200 cases a year of anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning. But what they're noticing is that these cases are taking much longer for even the animals that survive to treat them to the point where they could be released. So, and they're also seeing a lot of complete nest eradication. So basically what we went through in Arlington with our great horned owls, where I said almost the entire nest died, where entire nests of great horned owls are dying from these poisons. This was a great horned owl nest in Cape Cod. It was 2 parents, and I think it was 3 babies. This poor baby was bleeding from every orifice. They gave him a blood transfusion. They could not save him. He died. The only survivor in that nest, so the other like 4 or 5 died. The only survivor, they had to give a blood transfusion of vitamin K every day for over 9 months until his blood would clot on his own again. They said that was unprecedented. But they're seeing things like that more and more, these multi-month rehabilitations to get the blood to clot again. And I think, again, that is pretty compelling evidence that these poisons are becoming so ubiquitous in our environment and in our food chain that these animals are getting a lot more compounded high amounts than they were even just 4 or 5 years ago. So the problem that I deal with when I'm trying to advocate on this issue is that the pest control professionals can legally lie about the impacts of Escars. They're under no legal obligation to tell the truth, even if when they're directly asked, as I found out all those years ago when I started talking to my landlord and the pest person who had put down the bait stations. And they have a very strong, sophisticated, well-oiled lobbying arm called the National Pest Management Association. The NPMA has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars just in the past decade wooing and contributing funds to the election campaigns of state and federal representatives. So that's what we're competing with. And the other problem is landlords and businesses themselves do not have to disclose what chemicals they're using to their employees or to their tenants as well. And just to show you I'm not exaggerating, when I was doing my article, it took them 2 months to give me this answer. I had to hound them. The EPA finally told me, when I kept asking them directly, that it is not a violation under federal law for a pest control professional to make inaccurate claims about the impact the products have on non-target animals. So there's no law about that, and only they said if the states want to pass laws about it, they can, but right now we do not in Massachusetts, and most states don't have laws about that either. I also interviewed former pest control professionals themselves, and this person told me the biggest commission that he got when he was working it was a very large national pest control company that has a lot of offices here in Massachusetts. He said their biggest commission came from these rodenticide subscriptions, and that's why they basically didn't care. He got fired because a news reporter asked him on air about non-poison alternatives, and he basically acknowledged that poisoning does happen to animals. For that, he got fired from the company. And this is a problem. This is a kind of an epidemic problem among the pest management sector here in the state. So this was a study that was done in 2017 where they did a survey of about 24 pest control professional companies and professionals in Massachusetts. They seemed to vary in how much they cared about the impacts on non-target species, but they showed to have a very low understanding, a low level of awareness about how potent escars are to these non-target species. What was also interesting is all of these respondents said that they were IPM or integrated pest management professionals. So I always tell people, just because someone tells you they're an IPM professional, do not assume that that means poison-free. Because, well, one, it doesn't, but many IPM professionals use poison quite frequently. And this was actually on the National Pest Management Association's main homepage of their website under their mission statement, which was to counteract activist efforts on both the national and local levels by being prepared to instantly respond on behalf of the industry. I actually called them out on my Save Arlington Wildlife Facebook page, and the next day they took that off their page. But I had the Wayback Machine, so I could go back and screenshot it. But I pointed out that quote because this was a bald eagle this spring that was found very sick in Connecticut, and he died. And they were actually on their way. They were looking to ban escars in Connecticut, and they had gotten a good amount of road paved for it. And then at like the last minute, like politicians started like walking it back and saying, no, it's too soon. We can't do it. It's going to be Ratmageddon. So instead, they walked it back, and now they're doing like a study committee. But this bald eagle had died around the time that they were supposed to make up their mind about whether or not they were going to be banning these poisons. Just again to show how strong the NPMA's influence can be. So one of the problems I run into a lot is I see dead and dying rats around Arlington. I don't know if other people have come across this as well. And it's interesting to me because one of the arguments is, we need to annihilate the rats because of the public health impacts rats cause. But it's not good for public health when there are dead and dying rats in the middle of the street. This was on Mass Ave in Arlington on an August afternoon in the middle of the day at 4 p.m. Like there was high foot traffic. There were little kids walking right by this rat. He was seizing. He was frothing at the mouth. And he was like 5 inches from a bait station. I did get someone to humanely euthanize him, and we disposed of his body so he couldn't get scavenged. But this is something I see quite regularly. It wasn't new to me, and it's something I see all the time. This was on the right, a rat that was struggling, and I came back an hour later, and it was still writhing on this person's porch, and this person had 20 bait stations that were clearly labeled that they had escars, and this home was actually 3 houses down from an elementary school, so there are also children that were, walking by at the end of the day. And that's from Spy Pond just a few weeks ago, that dead rat, and it was on the green right by the boat launch, and there were little kids playing football and landing near the rat, and there were people walking their dogs, and my partner and I had to get a trash bag and gloves to clean it up because we were concerned about, again, the public health implications and an animal getting it. And interestingly, the studies that have come out that have looked at rats, Norway rats, which are the rats we are dealing with here in Massachusetts, have found that those that have the anticoagulant rodenticides in their system actually are more likely to have leptospirosis and some other diseases than if they did not. So it actually increases the public health risks for them to have these poisons in their system, which makes sense, right? Because it lowers their immune system. It's the same way that foxes and coyotes are more susceptible to mange. It also makes these rodents more susceptible to diseases that they can transmit to humans. So if you have animals these rats now are more likely to have diseases because they have these poisons in their system, and now they're more likely to be in the middle of like a busy avenue where they're going to come into contact where a child or a pet is, you're actually increasing the likelihood of disease transmission. This is usually when I have a debate with a pest control professional, either publicly, I had one on the Boston Globe, or when I talk to people about what the main concerns about rats are, I always talk about the plague, and I'll get to that in a second. I mean, it gets brought up all the time. But I also think it's important to really interrogate why we hate and fear rats so much, because I think that's what gets us in trouble, is some of these reactions that then wind up, ironically, making the rodent problem worse, but then annihilating other species with them. And I do think there's a lot of myths and stereotypes that are deeply entrenched in our psyche that sometimes we're reacting to, and that's why we have the current situation we have. And I've seen some really nasty comments when I go online where people make comments, oh, well, there's an affordable housing complex opening up in town. I guess that's where the rats will be. And so I think it's good to think about, too, where these these prejudices come from, because a lot of them are not true. Now, I'm not trying to at all dismiss that rats are a valid public health concern, but I do think that the pest control companies greatly overstate those risks, and that's what I find as a journalist looking at the statistics and the actual rates, and they exploit people's fears to make them get these poisons and act like nothing else is going to work. For instance, I've had 3 people bring up rabies to me about rats and mice in the past week, and that doesn't happen, so it's not impossible, but rats and mice are not a rabies vector species. It's virtually unheard of. And most disease transmissions are extremely low. You're actually much more likely as a child to be poisoned by rat poison than sickened by a rat. You're much more likely, like by hundreds of times, to be bitten by a dog than a rat. So I think it's just important to think about these things when people make decisions about how we're going to manage them. And finally, about the plague, which I really do hear all of the time, the experts are finding that they were not responsible for the Black Death of the Middle Ages, but it is still something that's just so widely believed. Again, that it's sort of like a hair trigger response when people bring that in. But why are we getting more rats? Climate change is part of the problem. We're having warmer winters, so they can reproduce all year long, and they can have larger litters. More people equals more rats. It equals more trash, and then more rats that way as well. And we are becoming more population dense in this area. Construction doesn't necessarily increase the populations themselves, but studies do show that they're more likely to be active and come into areas where people don't want them if you're scaring them out of the sewers and other places. The pandemic, when the restaurants shut down, it did push some rat populations into more residential areas, but also because more people were working or going to school from home, they might have just been more likely to see them. And ironically, poison itself might be a contributor to that increase, and I will get into why. So there's not a single study, and when I was doing my article in 2021, I was actually really surprised about this. I spent weeks, I asked all these researchers and rat ecologists. I couldn't find a single study proving the efficacy of anticoagulant rodenticides in reducing rodents in urban and suburban ecosystems, or really hardly anywhere. They're mostly just lab studies, and they're very small, not translatable to these ecosystems. And I also found that sightings of rodents and reports of rat activity actually had significantly increased with the increase in AR poisons in the area. That doesn't necessarily mean that the poisons have caused those increases, but it does show that those poisons are not effective at reducing them, at least in a meaningful way. So bait acts as a lure. So if you're putting down a bunch of bait, rodenticide bait, and you're just leaving it out there, you're going to lure rodents to the area. The rats and the mice can build resistance to these poisons. The reason why second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides were developed were because the first generation, the rodents built biological resistance to them, or immunity, kind of like antibiotic resistance. And studies are already showing that rats and mice are now building resistance to eschars. So what makes me very sad is the irony that a good percentage of these rodents may not even be killed by these poisons, but the predators, which have not built biological resistance because they do not breed enough to do that, to build that resistance, they have not built it, so they're getting killed off, whereas the rodents are always going to be able to outbreed the poison. Killing natural predators inflates rodent populations. So I mentioned my background is in wildlife biology. I was studying to be a wolf biologist. So I studied a lot predator-prey dynamics, and I don't know if you've heard of trophic cascades, which is the idea that if you're going to kill off, a top-tier predator or a bottom of the food chain prey item, it's going to have ripple effects through the whole food chain, a lot of which you do not want. So you may have heard the case in Yellowstone, because they had killed off all the wolves, the deer exploded, and then they overgrazed everything, but then all these other species started dying off because there was nothing that could grow. So similarly, if we're going to kill off all our birds of prey and our other predators, we're going to wind up with a lot more rodents, and all of the fallout that comes from that. And this is actually from Raptors Are the Solution, that kind of talks about that bait cycle, like that quote I had from that former pest control professional, which talked about how it's like their biggest revenue stream. They subsist on these quarterly subscriptions where you come every 3 or 4 months and you restock the bait stations. But what that does is it creates this feedback loop, this perpetual cycle where you're drawing rodents into the area. They're eating them. Only a small percentage of them are probably dying. And by the time they die or move on, more are being born because they're having new babies constantly, or new ones are getting drawn to the area. So you're not actually addressing the root cause of this problem. So there are a lot of other things you can do to try to manage rodents. These are just more of do-it-yourself type things that I always start off telling people. I'm an avid birder. I love birds, but I do think we should reconsider bird feeders at least most of the year. Winter, so obviously when birds are really struggling, songbirds. There's some science that it can help, but for the rest of the year when they have more natural diets, because there are studies that show that rats actually will build and burrows around bird feeders, and there is a direct correlation between homes with bird feeders and where rat burrows are in suburban areas. So there's some good data out there to show that if we had less bird feeders, we might be able to reduce our overall rat populations. And some other things keeping our composting inaccessible or even indoors, picking up pet waste, only taking out trash the night before the morning of pickup, and to look at exclusion in our buildings. But here's the larger thing, and here's kind of the ask, now that I've taken you on this journey about the things that maybe you could do on the larger level other than just, stuff in your backyard. Here in Arlington, I started Save Arlington Wildlife with some folks, and we did a bunch of different things to kind of raise awareness. We did a poison-free pledge campaign. We went around to different businesses, ones that weren't using bait stations. We asked them if they wanted to sign up. Part of that was more just to sort of build excitement and raise awareness about this issue. But then what we did is we also started pushing to restrict anticoagulant rodenticides on our municipal lands. So unfortunately, the state does not let towns and cities ban on private property, but you can ban it but towns and cities can ban it on their property, on their public property. So their parks and their libraries and their schools, if they own those buildings or lands, they could ban it. And that's what Arlington did in 2022. And I want to mention, to call back to what happened with C25 and our owl population. Months before that happened, the select board had the opportunity to vote a pretty conservative bill through the town, and they didn't do it. They punted on it, and they said, we don't have a rat problem. We don't have a rat poison problem. We don't think we need to do anything right now. And then 3 months later, our bald eagle died, and then another 6 months later, our great horned owl family died, and the select board got quite a bit of backlash from the public. And I think that, so when much more progressive policies came through as proposed warrants, they were willing to vote for it. And I think it's, a good story to tell other municipalities considering this, that you don't want to be the place that said no and then you lost a bald eagle in your town or city, or that lost a whole family of great horned owls when you had an opportunity to do something more. So we also submitted a home rule petition to the state asking that they let us ban on private property, and The city of Newton also did the same in June, so they followed suit. So now there's 2 municipalities that have now asked the state, can we please ban this on private property, which is where the bulk of these poisons are being used and applied. And then there's some other things like, so local boards of health, and sometimes they work with public works. Often when there's a demolition of a building for a construction project, they have to do a rodent management project. So what I did with my town is I did a public records request, and I found like that 30 out of 32 of those buildings, they were using SCARs. And so I worked with the Board of Health for them to come up with a different IPM plan that disincentivized use of poisons for those construction projects in the pre-development stage. And we also did an open letter to the Arlington Housing Authority, which is separate from, the town or city does not have direct jurisdiction over them. So we appealed to them separately with an open letter, and they also phased out ARs on their land in Arlington. So as I mentioned, the Arlington passed the non-binding resolution, which the town manager adopted as that public ban, and then we did the home rule petition, and then the city of Newton followed suit, banning SCARs on its public lands and submitting a home rule petition. Before I move on, I just want to say a big news is that Mass Audubon is now partnering with Save Arlington Wildlife and is working with us so that if there's anybody who wants to sort of bring similar campaigns to their municipality to see if they can ban these poisons on public lands and get a home rule petition submitted. Now you'll have extra resources because I'm just one person stretched way too thin, but Mass Audubon is willing to help mobilize their memberships that are in, their members that are in those towns and cities, and help to invest resources. So if you're interested, let me know. I think someone from Mass Audubon is also here tonight and willing to speak to anyone who's interested in that. These are some IPM strategies that the city of Somerville is using as well that might be something that you could look into or suggest to your town or city. Full disclosure, though, Somerville was not using SCARs on their municipal lands when I interviewed them in 2018 about these, but they are now, which is a bit of a sore spot with me with them, and I'm talking to some other folks in Somerville who are interested in some action on this. But they did give rat-resistant trash toters to every household. They required dumpster licensing for all their large dumpsters, where they have to be cleaned and get inspection, I think, twice a year. They did a contrapest pilot, which is, basically birth control for rats, and it was only a short-term pilot. They didn't think it did as well long-term, but it did help knock the rodent populations down in the pilot areas from 57 to 67%. And then they did the high-volume electric traps as well, which Arlington is also doing. A number of the other cities and towns are also doing, and they did a bunch of education and awareness programs to help citizens think more about what they might be doing on their properties unwittingly to attract rodents and help address that. And to the point someone asked before, not all bait stations that you see are going to have poison in them. Some of them might have contrapests. Some of them might have snap traps in them. What I usually tell people to do is to look for a label. They're supposed to be labeled in most cases where it'll say what they have on them, but they're not always labeled. But if they are labeled with the poison, that's usually a pretty strong indicator. And if not, you can ask the business or the building that's using it. And if you have a good reason to think there is poison, but it's not labeled correctly, you can call the state, the MA Department of Agriculture, and you can report it and see if they'll come and inspect and make sure they're properly labeled. And here's just some other ideas that some other municipalities have done: better signage and enforcement of wildlife feeding laws. That's a big problem around a lot of ponds, I know. In Spy Pond, a lot of people will throw entire baguettes into the pond, and we do have a big rat population there, and they're surprised when I tell them you're not even supposed to feed wildlife here. I know the town of Belmont actually did carry in and carry out for trash in some of their park systems, where they got rid of the trash cans in some high volume areas so that people wouldn't use it, since a lot of the rodents were getting into those trash cans. Increased trash pickup. One of my former residences did that, where they were doing trash pickup twice a week till the rodents kind of went down. And then more of these rodent-resistant trash cans in some of the bigger town and city centers too have helped reduce rodent populations. So on the state level, as I talked about, we're very interested in trying to get more municipal laws passed. But the reason we have to ask for a home rule petition in the first place to be able to ban on private property is because the pest control lobby I think around 30 years ago, argued for something called preemption to a lot of state governments. And so there's a lot of laws 46 out of 50 states have these preemption laws on the books where towns and cities cannot ban any pesticide, including rodenticides, on private property. And a lot of states, including Massachusetts, have proposed legislation that would return that power back to the community, and that is one of the state proposed laws that Save Arlington Wildlife advocates for. And so if you are interested in also calling your rep or state senator and saying, I'm interested in you co-sponsoring or supporting this law, this bill as well. And even though the home rule petition for the town of Arlington is only for Arlington to ban on private property, it still has to go through the whole state legislature, has to go through all the committees. So, and it would establish an important legal precedent for other communities. So even if you're like, well, that's Arlington, consider talking to your rep or senator if you're not from Arlington and saying, I would like to see this passed because I'm interested in seeing more laws where I live restricting these poisons. We did do a State House rally in May when there was a hearing for those bills that got picked up by a number of outlets, including the Boston Herald. And actually, the Boston Globe editorial board was there. And so they did a top-page editorial on the issue of these poisons impacting bald eagles and great horned owls and arguing for our home rule petition, which was a big deal because usually the Boston Globe doesn't support like smaller home rule petitions of one community. I'm in the home stretch, only a few more slides. So again, this is just about the preemption issue. So not only is the pest control lobby, I told you they've fought for the state to have preemption, they've even fought to try to get it in the farm bill so that the federal government can preempt states from being able to restrict these poisons. Now, it doesn't look like that's going anywhere, but to just show you, because I think they're getting nervous that some states have these proposed warrants or bills. So what Save Arlington Wildlife does is we seed groups and initiatives in other towns and cities to pass municipal laws and home rule petitions like we did. And we do other stuff too, but that's just one of our overriding goals right now. And we work closely in collaboration with these groups to push for state legislation together, like that local control bill I showed you. And you may have heard of the Hawkins bill, which is a database that would basically show where these poisons are being put down. It's a digital database that would track them. And we currently have chapters in Belmont, Lexington, Waltham, Winchester, and Natick, and we have several other places that are also interested in starting initiatives there. So this is my last main slide, and I just wanted to bring back up why it's so important to me to get these kind of mobilize other communities. Is we've done about as much as we can do in Arlington with our local laws, but wildlife do not adhere to municipal borders. And, you know, MK, in the days and weeks leading up to her death, she was spotted at Fresh Pond in Cambridge. She was spotted at, I think, Horn Pond in the Islands part in the middle of the pond. She was always on, like, the Mystic Lakes in Winchester, you know, and she was seen along the Mystic River in Medford. So if we don't have more coordination with the other municipalities, we don't even know if MK, with C25, her offspring, we know that that rat was nearby because they stay close to the nest when they have babies. But MK she was getting around all over the Boston metro area, and she could have picked up a poisoned rat, any of those areas she visited, or several. And so we don't want to see that happening again. This is MK's widower, KZ, and he now has a new mate. But they did not have babies last year. And see, like I said, these disrupt breeding cycles. Like that great horned owl pair, when they died and he got a new mate, they didn't have babies that year. KZ and his new mate did not have babies last spring. So you skip a whole breeding cycle with no offspring, and then we don't have those babies in the area also that are getting fed rats or rodents. So I think KZ is actually nesting with his new mate somewhere along the lake, I think right on the border of Winchester. And as you can see in this picture, this is just from 2 weeks ago. That's him with a rat in his talons, and that's in Winchester. And so I just don't, I hope folks in Winchester will think about this as well, maybe as an effort that you could undertake here. I've been working with some folks with the Save Winchester Wildlife Group. They're a great bunch, but I think they need some more help. Like, it's a small group, and everyone's busy, but the more the merrier. But this is something that I'm concerned about going into the breed. Right now, we're about to go into the mating season for great horned owls, and I just found out the great horned owl at Menotomy Rocks Park, the female's gone. She's gone. Like, no one knows what happened to her. So that would be a third female that he's lost. And I'm not saying it's definitely poison. We don't know. But to lose 3 mates in 2 years is a lot. The great horned owl couple in Belmont, they've been together 14 years. So if you're interested in supporting Save Arlington Wildlife, we have a Patreon. You can PayPal me directly. I am looking into trying to get a fiscal sponsor for nonprofit so I can get donations more traditionally as a nonprofit, but right now it's basically just me working as an independent advocate. And we do have t-shirts like that one up there if you want to just see a sample for sale, and I get some of the proceeds from that. So that's just some ways you can contribute if you want to these efforts. And also there's like a little donation can if you want to put if you have a couple of dollars, anything would be appreciated. But I wanted to come full circle to our Rachel Carson, like I quoted from a different thing to start with, and this is the end, like near the end of her book, I believe. How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Yet this is precisely what we have done. We have done it, moreover, for reasons that collapse the moment we examine them. So it felt like it had bearing here as we examine this case as well. So thank you, and I'm willing to answer some questions if people are interested. Yes?
The bill regarding relative to the private one, the state.
Do you mean the Hawkins bill, or are you talking about?
About having jurisdiction on private land, I think that was the whole rule.
Are you talking about our home rule petition? So it's still sort of languishing in committee the last I checked. So we had our hearing in May at the Committee for Environment and Natural Resources, as did the Hawkins bill and as did the local control bill. The Hawkins bill did get voted out of committee. It was expected to, but they have not voted on ours yet. I think they have till the end of the year or the end of January. My concern, and this happens a lot, so Massachusetts is one of the most onerous states to get a bill passed through like traditionally legislative routes. I used to work in Capitol Hill on federal bills for the National Wildlife Federation, and I feel like Massachusetts is more convoluted than what I did back then, which is one reason why we're interested in getting more home rule petitions in, because there's a chance that the state would independently maybe revise their policies without having to push them through legislation. That's not to say we still don't want it to go through, but we are also practical, and we know that a lot of times these bills, like, I forget the number, there's some really large number of, like, I think it's tens of thousands of bills get introduced, or thousands of bills every year, and only like a dozen make it through to law or something like that. So we know our odds are stacked against us, but that's why I think every time another place joins us, it increases our chances of getting these policies changed. Because there was, I think it was about renewable energy. There was 3 or 4 communities did home rule petitions on renewable energy. And the state was just like, okay, we're going to change the rules so it's obvious this is bothering people, and we don't want to look bad. Because it starts to look, yeah. So we're just waiting, but there's still time to write the committee, and to the state, it's the State Committee of Environment and Natural Resources. There's still time to write them if you want and say, I would like to see this home rule petition pass, and there's still time to write your representatives and senators and say, have you co-sponsored this, and if not, can you see if you can support this? Yeah, so there's different groups that do these signs. So Save Arlington Wildlife, we actually work with the Friends of Menotomy Rocks Park, and they're very generous. You know, they have nonprofit status and I don't, so they usually work through that, and they get the signs to me, and sometimes they give them out on their own. But it was their decision to put my website, not me, but since I'm the one who does all the work with that, but they're the ones that do it with our, but I know Jim Joyce is here, and he does some with Friends of Horn Pond. And Save Winchester Wildlife has independently done some signs. I think they might have some tonight. So there are different sources that you can ask, but you can always PM Save Arlington Wildlife, and I can find a way to hook you up with some sign through me or another source. Yes?
I guess I'm Save Winchester Wildlife. Okay.
Yes.
I didn't know that, so I'm happy to have another thing I don't have time to do. But Jim Joyce is here, and he has some to sell. I've got one left over, because when I offer them on Facebook, sometimes people aren't able to pick them up. I don't know, they disappear. And the price for ours is $9. So if you got a $10 bill, nobody carries cash. I'll trust you. I don't know about Jim. And maybe yours are cheaper, so maybe yours are free. I don't know. And I don't have time to be the Save Winchester Wildlife, so please, somebody take it over. Thank you.
And Joyce, Laura, I have 10 signs.
Oh, great.
Tonight, if anyone wants them. Signs and stands.
Yeah, the signs have been really a great way to increase awareness around like the whole area. And for us in Arlington, it's been great. It hasn't even just been homeowners. Several of the local churches have the signs on their greens. And Wright Locke Farm has a sign here. You may have seen it. So also, if you have places, if you're part of a church or an organization, and if you want to talk to them and see if they are willing to host a sign, that would be a great way to also, I think, help build momentum and show growing support for this issue. Yes, Eric.
So we've already focused a lot on both aspects when we lose raptors.
Mm-hmm.
One is tragic. We miss it in the community. People who rely on the green spaces lose that access to wildlife.
Yes.
But two, the raptors are really good at taking care of rats themselves.
Yes.
Can you give some numbers around
Yes. This is my partner, and he's so good because he knows this issue so well vicariously through me, so he always also notes if I missed what he thinks is an important point. So a great horned owl can eat like 1,500 rats in a year or 4,000 mice. So we're talking about thousands of rodents. And if you have a family of great horned owls, that would be easily 5,000 rodents a year that they're extirpating for you. And unlike poison, they're not going, rats can learn bait shyness, which is a phenomenon where they're clever, they can learn that there's something that's going on with whatever's in that box, or they don't like the taste, they're very picky in some ways. Surprisingly sometimes, but they can also sometimes deduce that something might not be good for them. But they can't avoid a predator the way they can learn to avoid a bait box, and they can't build biological resistance. These prey and predator relationships have evolved over millions of years. They've perfected things that we cannot. So yeah, these animals really do provide extremely adept rodent control that I do not think we want to keep messing with. And there was a study out of California that looked, they had a place with AR poison bait stations and then a control site, and then they had another site with no poison bait stations but had a very healthy population of red-tailed hawks and great horned owls. And it wasn't even a contest which site had more rodent control. The birds of prey were more than 50% more effective at controlling the rodents than the poisons. And that's just from a baseline number. But, I would like to see more studies like that. But yeah, so those are some numbers. Thank you.
Do you want to know about the electric tracks? Does anybody want to know about those? Because they're right across the street, and there are two people here that know all about them.
What do you mean right across the street?
Is there a pilot site?
I could just mention, I'm involved in the community garden that's across the road, and we have one of those say no to rats.
Yes, I saw.
It's nice and conspicuous there. But we do have had a rat problem where they keep eating food. One solution we had is to encourage all of our gardeners not to bring any compost
Yeah.
to the site. I think that's helped.
Yes.
I am a big believer in snap traps, but rats are very cagey about them.
Yeah.
Last year, this whole year, I caught 3 in snap traps out of setting dozens and dozens. In fact, I do them in bulk. I have a whole row of them so they can't pass them. But anyway, we had an electronic trap there, but I really don't know. That was put there by the town, and I'm not clear as to how many they caught. I didn't have any personal contact with that, so I don't know how effective they are. Also, they did a CO2 application. I personally think that might be, and my hunch is that may be somewhat effective.
The dry ice
The
application.
dry ice into the burrows and block them off so they suffocate.
Well, the electric traps were an experiment that the town did, and the problem with electric traps is you've got to take the dead rat out eventually. They have a little elevator or something that moves the dead rat over to here, but sooner or later, there's labor involved, and the town hasn't been ready to expand that.
And I'm sure they're very expensive. I couldn't figure out how much they cost, but
non-specific, right? You know, chipmunks, other things, of course.
Unfortunately, I think that's true of basically there's nothing that's not going to, the same thing as with the anticoagulants and poisons.
Right.
Snap traps, too, can capture other things in them that can fit into those bait boxes. Yes?
What is the efficacy of the contrapest control method sort of compared to the anticoagulants, and sort of, is there like a cost difference? Are the ARs is super cheap and the contrapest super expensive?
Yeah, the contrapest I was told was pretty expensive. When I first interviewed the city of Somerville 2018, and they had piloted, I think, in 2016, 2017. I think the price has gone down since then, but I know that was I think it was $70,000 to do a pilot, if I'm remembering correctly what the price was. They did get a knockdown. I think it was 57 to 67% at the 2 test pilot sites, which was decent. They're pretty good. And they said it helped complement the other efforts. It helped them knock it down to a more manageable level, which then they kind of took the rodent contraception away and focused more on like the IPMs, like the waste management and behavior stuff and other methods like that. They told me that there's some kinks. They said it's harder to do that in winter because that specific type of bait freezes. But the thing they said was that it was hard to see how effective it was. This was what the city of Somerville said, because the rats come and go and they breed. And I was like, but isn't that the same thing with the poison? Like, how do you know? They don't know at all. When I said, why did you guys go back to using poisons on your public lands when you weren't? They said that basically people wanted to see the baits there because it made them feel comforted, like something was getting done. Because I said, because I can't find studies that those are effective. So the complaints they had about the contrapest were where it came to we couldn't really get a good handle on to what degree it was reducing, if at all, the overall populations because they are so migratory rats and they do breed so much. Yeah, when I said, well, the poisons, isn't that the same thing? And he basically said, yeah, so it is. In laboratory settings and in more closed circuit areas, they have found some pretty good numbers for them reducing. I think Seattle had a really good pilot study with the contrapest. Of course, it's a little warmer there, more of the time of the year. And I do know that one of the co-founders of contrapest has split from that person, and they've come up with their own a competing product. So some places are now doing pilots of that, and so it'll be interesting to see if that might be even more effective than contrapest, because she supposedly improved upon that formula and worked out some of the kinks, including, I think, the freezing thing. Any other questions?
I just wonder about people who buy these poison things. They probably can buy them in hardware stores. And I wonder if we should try to ask a hardware store if they're willing to not sell.
So the escars are banned from hardware stores. Those were the ones that were banned because they were poisoning children. There was a period of a couple of years where the stores could sell out their existing inventory, but I think by 2018. So if you're seeing an escar and you just want to make sure it's one of the escar baits, then you should point it out to the hardware store because they're not supposed to. It's possible, I'm sure there might be some places in the middle of nowhere where no one has noticed where it's gathering dust. But the ones you're probably seeing are the bromethalin, which is the neurotoxin, the vitamin D, and or one of the first generations. As I mentioned, the first generations have been found to be poisoning a lot of children at a corresponding rate that the escar is used to. So that just feels like you just supplanted one problem with another. There has been emerging studies out of Tufts Wildlife Clinic that's now finding bromethalin, which is the neurotoxin, has been also bioaccumulating in birds of prey. And there was a bald eagle that died around the same time MK did in Saugus area. And it did not test positive for escars, but it tested positive for a very high level of bromethalin, and it was displaying all the signs of a neurotoxin and succumbed to those symptoms. So now I will say that one thing that happened when I was getting ready to do a talk here is I think MBTA commuter rail station was getting renovated here in Winchester. They were using bait boxes and they had told the media, don't worry, it's not that bad stuff, but it wasn't labeled. So I did a public records request. So it was not escars, but it was bromethalin. And bromethalin is not benign, and emerging studies are showing that is harming birds of prey. Which is one of my concerns. I don't want people to just want to slot in one poison for another, because I do worry that we're going to find out the hard way because some of these other poisons, it's just that they're not as ubiquitous or they have not been as extensively researched. So we may find out, as we are now with bromethalin, this too is very harmful for birds of prey and could be killing off bald eagles. Vitamin D does not show in studies to work up the food chain at the way that the anticoagulants and bromethalin does, but vitamin D is very deadly, extremely deadly to dogs. So I do tell people you want to be very careful if you have a bait station that breaks open, because it's killed a number of dogs in Massachusetts. So, when we do our poison-free pledge to businesses, we tell them, we don't want you using any poison if you're signing up on our poison-free pledge campaign. But when we're doing our legislative work, we're mostly focusing on the escars right now, because that's the stuff that's causing the most problems. But we do just want people to be aware that we don't endorse any rodenticides, and we tell people to exercise caution with the non-anticoagulants, because some of them have their own problems that they can cause. And I don't want anyone's dog to die because, that happened, or another bald eagle to die because bromethalin is being baited all over the area instead of the escars. So, people could start talking to hardware stores about bromethalin is an idea. Yes?
Yeah, have there been any other countries with experience with this, like maybe in Europe, where escars have been legal in the past and banned completely, and how well it's gone for them?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for mentioning that. So I've mostly just been focusing here, but no EU nation has banned it. British Columbia banned these poisons. They did a temporary moratorium a few years ago, and it was so successful that they permanently adopted the moratorium. So it is now a permanent ban on escars. And the city of Richmond in the province of British Columbia even released a white paper that there's been no negative net impacts on their economy at all from banning it. So no, the rats are taking over and it's such an economic disaster. So they've permanently adopted it. It's still pretty early on. It's only been a few years, but so far it seems pretty positive. They have the people, the policymakers there. I don't speak to them, but my friend in California who worked on the ban there speaks to them. And it seems to be a pretty positive experience so far. And as people might know, California banned these poisons. I think it's been since 2020. And same thing, there's been no net cost to the economy, and there's been no Ratmageddon. So it is good to have these case studies so far that are going on in real time, that that these places have successfully phased out eschars in most sectors. All places have some exemptions, usually for agricultural industries or wineries. They're still allowed to use eschars, but most other industries are not. But yeah, it's still early though, so we'll probably learn more.
Like you said, they're not even shown to be effective, so why, or more effective than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why is
You didn't mention, I think it's called Ridex, like that expands in the rat's stomach and I guess starves.
Yeah, it like fatally dehydrates them. So there's many other products. I have on the Save Arlington Wildlife website, I have like a lot of useful links. One of them is an activist toolkit if people are interested in doing any of these local efforts similar to what we did in Arlington. There's a frequently asked questions page, which is kind of a living and growing model. I'm going to be adding more questions to it as I get more, but there are a lot of question and answers on the fact sheet if you want to look that up. But there is also an alternatives to rodenticide page. I do talk about Radex as well as dry ice, as well as a lot of the other things we spoke about tonight, contrapest. I don't know if there's been a lot of studies yet with Radex, but yeah, that is an alternative that is growing in popularity, which it's corn gluten and it fatally dehydrates the rats when they eat them. They get thirsty and they can't, something about the biology of rats, they can't throw up the way other animals can, so it just sort of expands in their stomach and it kills them that way. So it's a non-poisonous way to kill them. And it doesn't move up the food chain, obviously. And there's like another product, and I forget the name, that's also coming on the market that's similar, but it's potato starch and not Radex. So those are some other products that's available at the hardware store. We do have it on our alternatives to rodenticide page as well. I just want people to be aware, though, anytime you put any bait out and you just keep it out, you're going to keep luring more rodents. Like the suggestion with rodents is you always want to have like it's sort of limited and targeted to a specific time and like take it out with cycles so that you're not just having like a perpetual food source out for the rodents to be drawn to. Yes. Hi, Maggie.
Tell me about the pest control lobby. How powerful are they? What kind of money do they have? What do they do? How effective are they?
I don't know if we have enough time tonight for that. I feel like that could be a book. Like that was what I wrote one article for, and I'm actually writing a series of follow-up articles on that issue. Because that was something I was not really aware of. As I said, I used to work in Capitol Hill when I was doing advocacy in Washington, D.C. on climate change, and this started to remind me some of the stuff I was running into of like some of what I would see with the fossil fuel lobby when I used to advocate on climate change, like some of the tactics. But what I will say is that, as I noted, I think the open secrets are, if you go to my article from Salon, and it's hyperlinked. Open Secret has found that I think they've donated some. I think it's been hundreds of thousands of dollars in about the past 8 years to elected representatives, and that's been both state and federal. And it sort of peaked around COVID, and then it's gone down a little. I don't know if that's just with COVID, but it was interesting to me, and I'm not sure if this is why, but it went on an unprecedented level, the donations. Around the same time, they were having this legal battle over taking the eschars off the shelves. The thing that concerns me about them with the bait stations, that's the only way that these can be distributed, is what has happened is the pest control lobby has a monopoly on this product in these bait stations. And if people might have noticed some of the timeline around this area is that these bait stations with these poisons became very popular around 2015, 16. I never really saw these bait stations before that. I don't know if other people did, but that's when they really started mushrooming, becoming frequent. And that almost directly corresponds with when they were taken off the shelves. And this was the new monopoly the pest control companies had. And so I think that is part of what happened is they had this surplus of this product. And now there's a way to move it. And also, this also corresponded when we're having this big construction boom in most of the country, but in any kind of major metro area where people are like, oh my God, I'm so scared of all the rats we're going to see. So it was a good way to start telling people, we need these poisons. When it came to my building, that was when we were having, right a couple months before, we were having the Mass Ave project. And I don't know if anyone in this area remembers that in 2015, where they ripped up all of Mass Ave all along Arlington for like 2 square miles. And that's when all these bait stations started to it really did just proliferate from one end of the town to the other there. And it started first in the east section. So, when Carson wrote Silent Spring, the agrochemical industry spent $250,000 or $250,000 trying to discredit her. And that was in the 60s. That, I think, is adjusted for inflation, $2.5 million in today's money. And so I really think we're dealing with some similar power structures. I mean, a lot of those agrochemical companies are the same ones that manufactured these poisons. Now, there are the manufacturers, there are the people who have manufactured these, like Bell Labs, and then there are the pest control companies. And a lot of these may be just mom and pop shops. I do think a lot of them might just be trying to survive, but they are almost all of them are members of the National Pest Management Association or the New England Pest Management Association. And just as a quick story, when Arlington was doing its select board hearing for the ban on public lands in the home rule petition, a pest management professional showed up who was on our Facebook page, always saying that he was an IPM professional. He was like, I don't like poisons. He's like, I'm just here to be your friendly pest guy. He showed up to that hearing, and he almost single-handedly took down the bill, and it turned out he was the representative for the area for the New England Pest Management Association, and he had basically been listening in on all of our Facebook conversations and showed up. And it also turns out he is now on the study committee for the New Hampshire state. Now, they were also considering a ban in New Hampshire, and also that got walked back at the last minute with the lobby, and he is now sitting on that study committee as the professional, pest person. So he gets around. So he was, in Arlington testifying against our bill, but now he's on this study committee basically as the person who's saying, no, New Hampshire shouldn't ban these. So there are a lot of people in these that are part of the NPMA who are going to be you're going to get a lot of resistance probably. If you do this work, you'll see it when you start talking to these companies. Okay, thank you everybody.